My name is Anna Bertram, and I'm excited and feel very blessed to be able to give this, my witness to all of you today. But first I wanted to entrust this talk to our Blessed Mother, because I feel like without her and our Lord's graces, I don't think that I would be here right now. I don't think I'd be giving you this talk today, and I don't think I would be on the same path in my faith life that I am today without both of them. So if we can just start this talk first with a Hail Mary, and if you'd join me, please. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Thank you. So today I'd like to share my witness about how God brought beauty from the ashes of grief. But in order for you to see the beauty, I have to start a little bit back at the beginning. But before I do that, I'd really like to introduce you to my son, Adam. So this is my middle child, Adam Marshall Bertram, and I asked for his intercession a lot of times because he's my little saint in heaven. And as you'll continue to hear a little bit more about his story and how he has brought beauty from ashes. So one thing that you need to know about me is that I grew up, as many of you would call cradle Catholic. I had a wonderful influence of faith through my grandmother and through my parents. And I grew up in a very faithful household. My grandmother would have us pray the rosary daily, especially on our way to Mass, which always kind of like made me nervous because I don't know if any of you as a child, or maybe your children, I always messed up the Hail Mary. I would start with Holy Mary, Mother of God, and she would like give me this look like, what are you doing? So for me at first as a child, saying this prayer was actually really hard because I didn't want to get scolded by my grandmother. But as I grew, I learned to love this devotion, and it's part of something that I'd like to share today. Looking back, I can see how valuable this grace of faith and the devotion of the rosary has become in my life, and it has greatly shaped my belief in God. It gave me the many graces that I needed to walk my own De La Rosa. A little bit about my husband, Ken and I. Ken and I met on a blind date. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and I remember the moment that he walked in to my house. All my siblings were lined up, and my grandmother was there. And she asked him, "Are you Catholic?" And thank goodness, because he was. Because I don't know if she would have let me go out on that date. And my siblings, I'm the oldest of 6, so that's a pretty tall order of an introduction to your family. And it's one of the reasons and the ways I knew that he was the right person for me, because he didn't run out of the door. So we were engaged within 9 months, and then we were married within that year. And I have to say, the first year of married life, it was a challenge. It was very hard. We encountered the usual challenges, like who would cook and who would clean and who would put the seat down, which I grew up with mostly sisters, so the men always had to put the seat down, but not in his family. So that was a pet peeve of mine. So it wasn't obviously all roses and romance. In fact, I often wondered what I had gotten myself into. And then something finally clicked. We became parents, and we became responsible for someone other than ourselves. So in 2008, we welcomed our first son, Ross Allen Bertram. And he's named after Ken's maternal side of the family. Their last name is Ross, and my husband's middle name is Ross. So now we have a first, last, and middle name of being Ross in our family. And then Alan for both of his grandfathers. We were filled with joy in the newness of what a first child brings. And for me, this is where I had such a strong desire to share and live my faith more fully. Becoming a mom and sharing in the responsibility to teach Ross about God and the Catholic faith became so important to me. During this time, I learned how selfish I really was. I learned a lot about caring for another person, but most importantly, I grew in a relationship with God. I learned to rely on Him when sleeplessness and the smell of spit up were my new normal. When I was left counting poopy diapers and what time that last feeding was, I also prayed to Our Lady and asked for her intercession, asking for guidance and praying many rosaries while rocking a baby to sleep. This prayer practice turned into a lullaby, one sung Hail Mary after another. It helped me with offering up my nights, my spit-up stained shirts, my clogged milk ducts, and the poopy blowouts. This became my go-to prayer because I knew that Mary had also lived this life in the trenches of motherhood. After a couple years, God called us to welcome a second child, and we were so excited to learn that it was another boy, that Ross would have a brother, and he would be a big brother. My pregnancy was normal. It went very well, and towards the end of my due date, I started feeling contractions, the normal signs of labor. So Ken and I went to the hospital, and I was checked out. I was monitored for a little while, and ultimately I was sent home. I scheduled an appointment with my doctor because I felt a little off. I hadn't felt him kicking very much or moving around, so I started to be concerned. Again, I was reassured that everything was normal and looked okay, but since I was past my due date, my doctor suggested a C-section. So on April 2nd, we went into the operating room, excited to meet our second son. And I actually walked to the operating room because for some reason we decided that it would be better for me to have a spinal than an epidural, which ended up being, I feel like, God's grace in what was to come. I started praying to Mary and I asked for her intercession. And then I looked over to see Ken. His face was white. He wobbled a bit and he almost passed out. I thought it was jitters from seeing me being operated on, but I was soon noticed that the room was silent and the room was starting to become chaotic. As I glanced over, I saw our son Adam, but I didn't hear a cry. The nurses worked fast and they were able to make him cry, but his cry was small and very quiet. Not the sound I expected to hear, and very much different than Ross, who scored a 9.5. Like, we are really good at APGAR scores. Like, let's go. Ken was so proud that Ross scored a 9.5. He was telling everybody. And then we had Adam, and he scored a 2. So the next events were a whirlwind. Adam was rushed off to Akron Children's Hospital with Ken, and I was left behind in the hospital after just having a baby. I remember the worry that filled my soul, the doubt, the anger, the great sadness that filled my being. I had no idea if I would even get to hold my son or see him again alive. I was grateful that Ken was with Adam and that he called our parish priest for emergency baptism. I was released from the hospital the very next day. I remember getting up, taking a shower, doing all the things you have to do, and telling them I was leaving. So I was rushed from one hospital into another, and I was finally able to see Adam, what seemed to me like an eternity. We spent 26 days in the NICU, and while we were there, we were in the liturgical season of Lent, which for me was difficult because, as I said before, I had such a lack of hope, and all I could see is the death and not the resurrection in Easter. While we were there, I guess I just felt that I needed to pray because I didn't have the words and I didn't know how to feel. So once again, I offered up my rosary and the Litany of Mary for a miraculous healing of our son Adam. This sense of fragility in my life and in his life was very overwhelming, and it made me really realize my humanness. No longer did I know what to do or who to lean on. Many questions swirled around in my mind, and my faith was rattled. The hope I once had in God and his ability to make all things new suddenly seemed an illusion. But worst of all, I came face to face with my own inability to fix my son. I had no answers, only questions. All the whys and the what-ifs, it consumed me and drowned me. This heaviness, this feeling of helplessness, and my realization of my lack of trust in our God, it shook me to the core. Never had I ever experienced such grief and such sadness. Never had I ever experienced a trial before in my life. I was so ashamed to admit my doubt, especially before God. However, we had a wonderful parish priest who actually married us and baptized Ross and did a renewal with Adam since he had already been baptized. But I confessed this to him, and he gave me one of the greatest advices that I hope to pass on to you. He told me to continue to pray for the virtue of hope and to cultivate an attitude of gratefulness by creating what he called a litany of thanksgiving. He encouraged me to find things to thank God for at the end of each day, no matter how small, and to write them down and to start a journal. To pray my own litany of thanksgiving. This list helped me to look at my day and opened my eyes and heart to God's presence in my life. The very first thing I wrote as I looked back in my journal was that I was thankful for the gift to hold Adam and to nurse him. Such a seemingly simple act turned into so much more. I felt God's peace, and once more I turned to Mary, asking for her intercession. As the days in the NICU progressed, we were faced with yet another medical hurdle. Adam had grown a large mass on his left temple. The MRI results showed that it was adding pressure to his brain and blocking brain development and the growth of brain development. His neurologist informed us that he would have to have surgery to remove it. Already in a fragile medical state, I worried how he would come through the procedure. This worry was only compounded by the date of his surgery, which turned out to be Good Friday. My thoughts turned into Jesus' passion and death. I prayed mostly for peace, but I just couldn't see the resurrection in the Easter Sunday. As I worried, I asked and begged Mary to intercede for us. I started to pray the Litany of Loretto over my son while I rocked him. I would physically place my hands on the Mass and ask Mary to wipe it away. In haste, I also begged God for 8 months to know my son. On the morning of his surgery, the nurses and doctors rounded, and they were very surprised that the Mass had greatly diminished, so much so that they scheduled another MRI to see if maybe he would even need the surgery. Once the results came back, it turned out that he didn't need the surgery, and that the pressure had subsided since the size had diminished, and the neurologist was happy to tell me that there wasn't a need for surgery. I attribute this as a miracle to Mary. Just I had asked Mary to wipe away the Mass, away it had been. Even the neurologist was astounded and had no answers as to what could have caused such a significant reduction in size. Looking back on this moment, I can see why I would have needed a miracle. It was preparing me for what was to come. We were able to bring Adam home and start a life again. I continued to hold Mary close in prayer and turn to her often when feeling overwhelmed in my motherhood. Adam was such a smiley baby. As you can tell from the pictures, that was his demeanor and that was his face. He just brought so much joy to everybody around him. Adam was such a smiley baby and very content with the world. We did a lot of living with him and his brother Ross and created many memories together. When Adam was 6 months old, he started to become fussy to the point where he was unconsolable. We found ourselves once again back at Akron Children's Hospital. Oh, thanks. I actually do have crumpled. I prepared. I thought if I can't get through this talking to my husband about it, I probably can't get through talking to you. But I'll try not to ugly cry. No guarantees. When he was 6 months old, he started to become very fussy, and we ended up back at Akron Children's Hospital. Only instead of being admitted to the NICU, we found ourselves in the pediatric intensive care unit. We were told rather quickly that Adam had cancer. It was on his ribs and around his lungs. It had spread throughout his body. Even though I was devastated by the news, I found hope. The doubts and fears that had once almost paralyzed me in the NICU transformed into feelings of hope and trust in his mercy. Throughout this hospital stay, I witnessed many moments of God's loving care. He was there to put the right people in place to make sure Adam received the best care. One example of this is the day that he started his chemo treatments. The technician who mixed the chemo for him ended up being a friend of a friend of a friend who was praying for Adam, someone so removed from our lives. And she came up to the room that day and she told me not to worry because she had prayed over the chemo. In this moment, I saw God. And I thanked her for her prayers. She came, so whatever the outcome I could see for him with us, and that gave me such hope. Another practice that continued was my litany of thanksgiving. I continued to journal, and I continued to pray the litany of Loretto and the rosary. I prayed for my son, and I also prayed for others that had reached out to me for prayers, especially the nurses and doctors. It was amazing to be able to sit in a room all day and just pray. And not only pray for my son, but pray for the people that were impacting him day to day. I went also asking once more for her intercession, and I couldn't find the words. So I entrusted my heart to the Blessed Mother, knowing that he could not deny his mother. The mystery that brought me so very close to this was the luminous mystery of the wedding feast in Cana. When contemplating this mystery, I placed myself in Mary's footsteps and asked our Lord to perform a miracle. Once again, to heal my son through his mother's intercession. We spent 3 months in the hospital. We were told that there was nothing more medically that the doctors could do for Adam. The cancer that Adam had was an unknown type of pediatric cancer and very rare. Nothing the doctors had ever seen before. There was no medical protocol for the chemo, and his pathology was sent across the country to many pediatric oncologists. The mass on his temple also mysteriously came back. And I knew this was the beginning of the end, that only God could heal our son. With Christmas around the corner, we chose to bring him home on palliative care.
This was a very hard decision for us to make, but I knew that it had always been up to God to heal our son. So we entrusted this into his hands and continued to pray for healing. The transition from hospital to home was hard. We didn't have the correct working equipment or correct size we needed for an infant. I remember my engineer husband and my father-in-law one night trying to calculate the amount that they needed to push through an IV to feed our son because the pump was not working that they had sent to us. But there in that moment, I witnessed my husband and the incredible amount of care that he put into taking care of our son. Because up until this point, I had been the one in the hospital, and I had been the one staying there every day, and he had been the one being like St. Joseph, quiet in the background, supporting me, supporting our son Ross, and getting everybody together that needed to be together. There was a lot of things that could have been better on the return home, but I was grateful to be back at home with Adam and our family. The days passed slowly while Adam's health declined quickly, and on December 23rd, he took his last breath with me and his father lying next to him. He was 8 months old. It's been 8 years since Adam has passed into heaven. And in 8 years, I have pondered many things in my heart. Some things that I may never know the answers to. And I can finally say I'm content with that. But here is what I feel called to share with you today. Number 1, instill in your children a relationship with the Blessed Mother. Don't be afraid to do this, for she always points us towards her son, Jesus. Without this relationship, I don't know how I would have had the faith and prayerful perseverance to journey my own Via Dolorosa. St. Maximilian Kolbe has said to never be afraid to love the Blessed Virgin too much. You can never love her more than Jesus did. This example that I talked about previously of my grandmother and the rosary greatly impacted my life and greatly impacted my faith. And I think that it was her example in my younger years that helped me to get through the trials that life brings us. Also, pray the rosary. If you want a relationship with Mary, you must pray the rosary. Sister Lucia Fatima said, "There is no problem, I tell you, no matter how difficult it is, that we cannot solve by the prayer of the Holy Rosary. The graces received through this prayer will help you through all life's trials." At times when you just don't have the words and you don't know how to talk to God, this devotion can speak for you. God knows your heart. Number 3, try to discern the beauty that God is calling you to in times of trial. For me, it has been seeing Mary in a new light, not just as the new mother in the Nativity, but also as Our Lady of Sorrows. Knowing that, in a way, we are united in suffering to the cross makes me hopeful in this life. It has led me to continue to share her with others who may not know her. And I'd like to share on the next slide. This is one of the ways that our family has chosen to honor Mary. These are trees that have been donated and decorated by our family. Not just me and my husband, but my children now help, and my mother-in-law and my mother, and many aunts and uncles. The Holiday Tree Festival at Akron Children's Hospital has become not just this place where I can donate and contribute and give back to the hospital that once helped my son and helped us through our grieving process, but also a way of healing through the grief. And who knew decorating a Christmas tree could bring that? Certainly not me. Our first tree, it was dedicated in memorial to my son Adam specifically. It is called Angel's Wings. You can see it's all the way down on the bottom of the right. But this tree was actually put in the newspaper. And for me, that was a sign that I was on the right track. Because throughout this grieving process, I was worried that I was missing something. I was worried that I didn't know what my call was. And I was worried that I might miss my purpose. And this tree helped start what I lovingly call our litany to Mary. So each tree after that has been dedicated to Mary, and each name comes from the litany of Loretto. Morning Star, Gate of Heaven, Stella Maris, Mystical Rose, and Queen of Angels. And next year's tree will be Mother of God. I already know. I pray specifically for the name of each tree with an intention to evangelize, to spread this love and devotion of Mary to others. That, I mean, when you're walking through a tree festival, that to me is just, I don't know, I love when they're lit up. And I think that for our family, it's also drawn us closer to our Blessed Mother. So it was never my intent to evangelize this way. I really, like I said before, I did it as a memorial to my son. But God has a way to turn your grief and your sorrow into beauty, into creating something new. And this is what he has done for me and our family, and he continues to do through this witness. And so if I can just impress upon anything from this story is my love and my devotion to the Blessed Mother. And I hope that if you don't have that relationship, you'll consider taking time to cultivate that with her. So thank you.